All right, we're going to get into a really fascinating and honestly tragic legal case from the Philippines. It's about a man who commits a terrible crime and confesses right away. And yet, the whole legal system gets tangled up in two huge questions. Was he really responsible? And what's the right punishment? This case, it really gets to the core of guilt, madness, and the strict letter of the law. And this is the central mystery of the whole thing. The guy, Milicio Robiños, told everyone he killed his wife, who was 6 months pregnant. The crime was incredibly brutal, nobody disputed the facts. So how on earth did he avoid the death penalty? That's the puzzle we're going to piece together right now. So let's start with what we know for sure. Picture this. It's March 25th, 1995 in Kamaling, Tarlac. Inside their house, Milicio Robiños attacks his wife, Lorenza. And what happened in those next few moments was so shocking it would spark a legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. 41. Just let that number sink in. That's how many times Lorenza Robiños was stabbed. This tells you right away this wasn't just some single moment of rage. It was a frenzied, horrific attack. Now, their 15-year-old son was actually in the house, and he testified that this all started with an argument. He heard his mom, Lorenza, say those words to his dad. Right after that, he saw his father stab his mother, and he bolted to go get help. So we have this really crucial piece of context. The violence exploded out of a fight. And this is where it gets just bone-chilling. Right after the attack, Milicio Robiños sees his brother-in-law, Benjamin, off in the distance. And instead of trying to hide or run away, he shouts this at him. It's such a bizarre, taunting thing to say, and it really suggests he was aware of exactly what he'd just done. The confessions just kept coming. When a neighbor and the police showed up, they found Robiños holding his wife's body, blood-stained knife still in his hand. He immediately told them, flat out, "I killed my wife." He said it over and over. So at this point, you're thinking, okay, this is an open and shut case, right? Well, this is where that open and shut case takes a massive turn. Because despite all the evidence, despite his own confessions, when Milicio Robiños got to trial, his lawyers entered a plea that nobody was expecting. So on one side, you have the prosecution with a clear and very serious charge, parricide, killing a close family member, plus unintentional abortion. But the defense came back with something completely different. They didn't say he didn't do it. They said he shouldn't be held responsible because he was legally insane. But what does insanity actually mean in a court? Because it's not just about having a mental health issue. To be legally exempt, the defense has to prove that the accused had a complete and total break from reality, that they had no reason, no judgment, and no free will at the very moment the crime was happening. So this became the real battleground of the trial. The defense had to somehow prove that Robiños was in this state of total mental oblivion. But how do you prove that after the fact? Well, the law has a very, very high bar. Okay, first thing you gotta know is that the law has a default setting, and that default is sanity. So it's not the prosecutor's job to prove the guy was sane. It's 100% on the defense to bring clear, convincing proof to flip that presumption. And that is a really tough thing to do. And here it is. This is the single most important rule for this entire defense. The only thing the court cares about is what was going on in the defendant's head at the precise moment he was committing the crime. Not the week before, not the month after. It all comes down to those few violent moments. So what did the defense bring to the table? Well, they had his son talk about his father's paranoia in the days leading up to the murder. They had other inmates and a prison nurse describe his strange behavior after he was arrested. Staring into space, talking to himself. And finally, a psychiatrist examined him 6 months later and diagnosed him with psychosis. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that sounds pretty convincing. But the court completely disagreed. The judge looked at all that evidence, looked at the law, and threw out the insanity defense. So the big question is, why? The court's reasoning was actually very simple. It zeroed in on what Robiños did during and right after the crime. Think about it. The attack happened right after an argument. It wasn't random. Then he taunted his brother-in-law, which shows he knew what happened. And then he confessed, clearly. To the court, these just weren't the actions of a man who was completely out of his mind. And this Supreme Court ruling really hammers the point home. It basically says that evidence of insanity after the crime doesn't count towards acquittal. So while he might very well have been suffering from psychosis in prison, the law is just unflinching. That doesn't matter for determining his guilt for the act itself. The defense just couldn't prove he was insane at that one critical moment. So he's found guilty. The insanity defense failed. And given the absolute horror of the crime, 41 stab wounds on his pregnant wife, the trial court sentenced him to death. But that still wasn't the end of it. This brings us right back to our original question. Why was that sentence overturned? Here's the deal. In the Philippines, the crime of parricide isn't an automatic death sentence. Instead, the law presents two indivisible penalties, meaning the judge has to pick one or the other, with nothing in between. Reclusion perpetua, which is basically a life sentence, or death. And what's wild is how the law makes this decision. It's not about a judge's feeling. It's practically a formula. Article 63 of the revised penal code sets out these exact steps. 1. Find the two possible penalties. 2. Look for any legal reasons to make the punishment more severe or less severe, what they call aggravating or mitigating circumstances. And step 3, if there are none of those, the law demands you apply the lesser penalty. And here is the final, crucial twist. Despite how brutal this crime was, the prosecution never officially proved any of those legal aggravating circumstances in court. And because of that, the rule in Article 63 just automatically kicked in. The court's hands were tied. They had no legal choice but to impose the lesser sentence. So this is how it all shook out. The trial court, probably reacting to the sheer horror of it all, sentenced him to death. But when the case went up to the Supreme Court for review, the justices corrected the error. They weren't making a judgment on the morality of it. They were just strictly applying the formula from the law books. And the sentence was changed from death to reclusion perpetua. And that leaves us with this really tough question, doesn't it? This case shows the law working perfectly, exactly as it was designed. A super high standard for insanity was met, and a rigid rule for sentencing was followed to the letter. But does the final result feel like justice? It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the cold, hard logic of the law can lead to an outcome that just doesn't sit right with us.